Welcome to Public Interest Before Corporate Interest, a YouTube presentation. We're doing a series on the Eureka Rebellion. I'm holding the Eureka flag. Obviously, many people don't really know what the Eureka flag is all about, although it marks a pivotal moment in Australian history, past, present and future. So over the next 3 weeks, I will go through the background, the rebellion and the consequences. I think it's important that we look at this question with the 166th anniversary of the Eureka Rebellion falling on the Thursday, the 3rd of December this year. So we need to start, well, from the beginning. Obviously, in Australia was divided into over 220 individual First Nations states, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders had lived on this land for over 60,000 years. Some had continuous association with that land for 60,000. Other First Nations people, especially in the Torres Strait, maybe 8,000 to 10,000 years. And when the colonisers moved in, the most serious damage which was caused to Indigenous people was through pandemics. Now, we're all a little bit concerned about the COVID-19 pandemic and the effect it's having on the world. Let's not forget that when Europeans first colonised Australia, what actually occurred was their diseases destroyed cultures that have been living here for thousands of years. Smallpox, measles, diphtheria, typhus, typhoid. These are all diseases which were unknown in Australia, for which Indigenous people had no protection, no antibody protection. And if you read some of the first accounts of the Sydney settlement, you'll read accounts of people, Aboriginal people, dead on the beaches and on the cliffs in their hundreds from disease. So when the colonisers came to Victoria in 1835, initially illegally, and then they were incorporated by the British government in 1836, their first and most pressing campaign was to eradicate the Indigenous people from this country, eradicate them from Victoria. And they went about that with gusto. And if you look at the history of Tanaminewa and Mulwahina and the history of the First Nations people in Victoria and Tasmania, you can see how devastating that colonisation process was. So, and this colonisation process was based on the concept of rearing sheep. And over 700 squatters claimed Victoria for themselves. They went about using a ticket of leave men and women from the New South Wales penal colonies as cheap labour. So what would occur is that people from England would come across, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, wool was needed, land was acquired in the most brutal fashion from Indigenous Australians, and sheep runs became the norm in Victoria. Extensive sheep runs which were managed by 700 squatters. When gold was first discovered in 1851-52 in Victoria, the Victorian Legislative Council had an important decision to make. They relied on a cheap labour force to maintain their sheep and their profits. And obviously when there's a gold rush, people leave the poorly paid employment, move to the goldfields in search of their fortunes, a little bit like taking out your Tats Lotto ticket on Saturday night. So the Legislative Council made a very important decision, which was the most fundamental decision which led to the Eureka Rebellion in 1854. And that decision was not to tax the gold that came out of the ground, but to actually tax every individual miner. So we had a mining tax, and a mining tax gave you the privilege of working a claim usually about 5 metres by 5 metres for a month. and that mining tax had to be renewed every month. And the fact is that when you go gold mining, especially alluvial gold mining, 99% of people don't strike it rich, and only 1% strikes it rich. So we had on the goldfields people attempting to eke a living and stake a claim and find, treasure, and having to pay the princely sum of £5 a month, which was over a month's wages. And to enforce this policy, and the policy, as I said, was designed specifically to keep people down on the sheep farms. It was to keep the ticket of leave men and women as cheap labour on the farms. It didn't succeed, but that was the purpose of it. So the tax affected everybody who went gold mining except doctors, and I think women didn't have to pay the tax. So it became a huge issue throughout Victoria, not just on the Ballarat gold diggings, with the Castlemaine gold diggings, the Bendigo gold diggings, and gold diggings around the country, around Victoria. It became a huge issue. And it became a huge issue because the Victoria Police, which was officially formed in 1853, were poorly paid men, and most of their money came from a percentage of the penalty which was issued when gold miners did not have their licence on them. So if they didn't have their licence on them, they'd be chained to a tree outside the Ballarat police camp, which is on Camp Road, exactly near where Ballarat Trades Hall is these days. And they would be kept there until the fine was paid. And the police officer who made the arrest would get a percentage of the fine as a reward. So you can imagine how corruption in Victoria Police was a central element in the general feeling of despair and revolt which occurred on the goldfields. Now, there were movements on all the goldfields against the miners' licence, but the movement that we're most aware of is the movement in Ballarat, because it ended in an armed rebellion. It ended in a change, a dramatic change, a structural change in the way Victoria was ruled. Now, in 1854, people were flocking to the Ballarat goldfields, and by the end of October there were over 30,000 miners on the Ballarat goldfields. And let's not forget that 95% of these miners were immigrants and refugees, because in the Commonwealth, in the British Commonwealth, it gave you passage. If you lived in India, if you get to Australia, you get to Australia, because you were a British part of the British Empire. So you had these large number of people on the goldfields living in tents in the most basic conditions, having to find £5 every month to pay their miner's licence, being involved in a day-to-day conflict with Victoria Police, who are trying to augment their measly income by arresting people for not having licences on them, and then they would get a percentage of that. So you can imagine the turmoil that was happening on the goldfields, especially when the great majority, over 99%, weren't making much money out of digging for gold, because digging for gold is a little bit like winning Tatslotter or winning a major prize in Tatslotter. Not everybody wins. So on the 11th of November, that's right, that famous day, the 11th of November in Australian history. And the 11th of November in Australian history is important for a number of reasons. The first reason, it was the day that Ned Kelly was hung in Pentridge Prison on the 11th of November 1880. It was the day that the armistice was signed that allowed the survivors of the 420,000 Australians who volunteered to fight for God, King and Country in Europe to return. It was the day in 1975 when the Whitlam Labor government which was duly elected by the people, was dismissed by the Governor-General. But most importantly of all, on the 11th of November 1854, the Ballarat Reform League was formed. The Ballarat Reform League was the organisation which was behind the Eureka Rebellion in Ballarat. It was formed on the 11th of November 1854. And the demands which the Ballarat Reform League made on the government of the day were directly linked to the demands which were made by the British Chartists in the 1830s and early 1840s. The British Chartists were a mass movement which was looking for universal male suffrage. And if you look at the demands which were made by the Ballarat Reform League, two of the most important were universal male suffrage. So voting didn't depend on the amount of property you owned, and the payment of parliamentary representatives were just two of the number of demands which were made, and they are chartered in the Ballarat Reform League Charter. Now, as we know, a free press is instrumental in any society which has got some democratic tradition. And the extraordinary thing about Ballarat was Ballarat had 5 newspapers for a population of 25,000. And if it wasn't for the sympathetic editors of those newspapers, the most famous was Henry Seacombe, the Ballarat Rebellion would never have occurred. These newspapers were instrumental in getting the message out and promoting the idea of an Australian nationalism of Queen Victoria and the British Empire. Now let's look at who was in Ballarat in 1854. You had Chartists who had left England despairing at the resistance of the British Crown and the British government to incorporating them in the decision-making process, who had come here looking for their fortunes. You had American gold diggers who had left the Californian gold fields in the late 1840s and came to Victoria to look for gold. You had the odds and ends of the British Empire from Jamaica to India coming to Victoria to look for their fortunes. You had refugees from almost every European country, political refugees who were the survivors of the failed 1848 wave of revolutions which swept across Europe. So you had an educated, revolutionary group of people who believed that they had innate human rights. They had innate human rights they were born with, that no government or private entity could take away. This is their belief. And on the 29th of November 1854, what occurred is that the Ballarat Reform League had broken up into two factions. A peaceful faction, which was led by Humphrey, and a more radical direct action faction which was led by Laylaw. But how did we get to this point of a revolt? And this point occurred through some very interesting mechanisms. Now let's not forget that in 1854 there were no PA systems, there were no television cameras, there were no radios. So people had to address large gatherings. And the decision-making gathering which the Ballarat Reform League relied on was the mass meeting. And some of the mass meetings which were called in Ballarat had up to 15 to 18 to 20,000 of the 25,000 people living at Ballarat at those meetings. And what they did was extraordinary. They were able to pass motions as a mass meeting, which was put to them by the Ballarat Reform League, and then those motions were taken by delegates to Melbourne to negotiate with Governor Hotham, who had been inserted as Governor of Victoria because of his naval military background. Because the British government was quite concerned about what was happening on the goldfields across Victoria, the talk of revolution. So what we had these mass meetings which were based on the principles of direct democracy, and they chose delegates to discuss their decisions with the authorities. At the same time, they were involved in a constant battle with the Victoria Police, who continued to carry out raids in the goldfields trying to augment their income. So there was this tension between the Victoria Police and the authorities. But by now, the British government had brought in the 12th and the 40th regiments into Victoria, as well as a number of battleships and cannons to be used against the agitators in Ballarat. So at the eve of November 1854, on the 29th of November, the more radical faction broke away, went to Bakery Hill, and there swore one of the most significant oaths that has been sworn in the history of humanity. And that is the Eureka Oath. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. And the key essence of this oath is we, everybody, not just, single white men, but everybody. We swear by the Southern Cross. And just you think this is a Christian analogy, think again. These men and women that come to Victoria to create a new life for themselves, free of the class strictures of Europe, free of the feudalism, free of the inequalities. And when they lay down in their tents and looked up in the sky, they knew they were in the new land, because they could see the Southern Cross. And you can only see the Southern Cross in the Southern Hemisphere. So for them, the Southern Cross was a geographical reference, a reference to them making their lives a new life in this country. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other. That's about solidarity. And fight to defend our rights and liberties. As I said at the beginning, they believed they were born with inalienable rights and liberties that no government, no private organisation could take away from them. So this is an extraordinary oath which was sworn on the 29th of November by over 500 of the more radical miners, who then moved across to Eureka Claim and set up the Eureka Stockade. Everything was now set for confrontation with the authorities. But the story is that there are 4 central elements to Eureka, which we will discuss in the next 2 weeks. And these 4 central elements are incorporated in the Eureka Oath. The first element is direct democracy. They relied on direct democracy to make decisions in a delicate system. They did not rely on a representative, giving a representative a blank check to make decisions for them. It was about direct democracy. What is more direct action than taking up arms to defend your rights and liberties? They believed in internationalism. There were men and women of all colours, of all races, of all religions, who came together because of their common oppression. So we've got direct democracy, direct action, internationalism, and as they understood, solidarity was the only way they were going to overturn the mining licences and claim the rights and liberties which they believed they were born with. They were no longer willing to suffer the indignities, the inequalities, the squalor of life in the old world.